And now to introduce our 2 o'clock Interfaith Lecture Series here in the Hall of Philosophy, where this week we're presenting the theme, Biblical Literalism, a Gentile Heresy. Our very distinguished guest this week is John Shelby Spong. Bishop Spong, you must know what a blessing you've been to the Chautauqua community from the overwhelming response you've received, and we're very grateful that you and Christine are here with us this week, and we're already anticipating joyfully your next visit. You don't have to write another book to be invited back, but it does help. You should note that in one of his recent books, The Sins of Scripture, exposing the Bible's texts of hate to discover the God of love, this visionary public theologian and public bishop seeks to introduce readers to a proper way to engage the holy book of the Judeo-Christian tradition. Bishop Spong's extensive media appearances include a profile segment on 60 Minutes, as well as appearances on Good Morning America, Fox News, Politically Incorrect, Larry King Live, The O'Reilly Factor, William F. Buckley's Firing Line, and Extra. The title of his lecture today is The Crucifixion, an Interpretive Portrait. When I think about you, Bishop Spong, I think of the words of the philosopher Schopenhauer, who observed that all truth passes through 3 stages. First, it is ridiculed. Secondly, violently opposed. And third, accepted as self-evident. You'll be pleased to know that the bookstore has indeed received more copies of Jack's latest book, on which this week's lectures have been based. And so please look for them here, but also at the bookstore. We're most grateful to the Eileen and Warren Martin Lectureship for Emerging Studies in Bible and Theology for their generous support of this week's lectures. So now please join me in offering a warm Chautauqua welcome to Bishop Jack Shelby Spong.
Yes, sir. I hope you all noticed that among the television programs I've done was on the O'Reilly factor. Nobody laughed. Actually, I've been on Bill's program about 8 times. And the last time I was on it, I said to him, and I quote, "Bill, you're nothing but Rush Limbaugh with perfume." And we're still good friends. Thank you for being here. Our final session today, based on Biblical Literalism, a Gentile Heresy, which was published just last February, is based on a premise that I've tried to develop in each of the 5 sessions. That premise is that the Christian movement was born in the synagogue, that Jesus was passed on from life to life in the synagogue, and that in that process, the Hebrew Scriptures were wrapped around the memory of Jesus. His life was shaped by the experience of liturgy in the synagogue. The Jewish images of Messiah were adapted to be applied to him. It didn't happen that as fundamentalists used to say, that the Bible predicted and Jesus fulfilled. The fact is, they wrote the story of Jesus with the Bible open so that he would fulfill. It's a very different process, and every biblical scholar knows that. What I've done this week is to try to lift 5 episodes out of Matthew's Gospel that illustrate that if you read the Jesus story through Jewish lenses or with Jewish eyes, it becomes a profoundly different story. We looked at the virgin birth on Monday, at Joseph on Tuesday, at the shadow of Moses on Wednesday, at Judas Iscariot on Thursday. Today I want to turn to the Passion narrative, the story of the final week in the life of Jesus. Are you aware that from 25 to 40% of every one of the 4 Gospels has to do with the last 1 week of Jesus' life? The lowest percentage, 25%, is Luke. The highest percentage, 40%, is John. Mark and Matthew come in at some like 33 to 35%. But it is very clear from all four Gospels that the important moment when their eyes were opened to a new dimension was in that final week of Jesus' life. And most of us are familiar with many of the images of that final week. They float across our minds. We hear them read every Holy Week in our churches. We see them in the public arena during that period of time. We see them on television shows. And so they're familiar to you. When I say the Palm Sunday procession into Jerusalem, you have an image. When I say the Last Supper, the Garden of Gethsemane, the betrayal at midnight, the denial of Peter, the trial before Pilate, the torture, the robe, the crown of thorns, the crucifixion itself, the two thieves crucified according to this narrative on each side of Jesus, the cry of despair that comes from the cross, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" Darkness at noon, and finally the burial, accomplished at the hands of a person we've never met before in the biblical narrative named Joseph of Arimathea. If one is going to know anything about Jesus of Nazareth, it will be either about his birth or about his crucifixion, because these are the parts of his life that have invaded our whole civilization. But have you ever wondered where this material comes from? Is this the report of an eyewitness who followed the events of that last week of Jesus' life? Or is this something else that we've been reading all these years as if it's an eyewitness account? So today we plunge into this familiar territory in search for an answer to that question. It's fascinating to note that both Mark and Matthew, the two first Gospels to be written, state that when Jesus was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, all of his disciples forsook him and fled. Not some of them, but all of them. There are no disciples at the foot of the cross in these early Gospels. A disciple doesn't make it to the foot of the cross until John's Gospel in the 10th decade. They're simply absent. If all of his disciples forsook him and fled, who was there to record this narrative? Is it possible that Jesus actually died alone? If he died alone, there would be no eyewitnesses. But people would say, oh, but the women were there. The Bible tells us that. If you read the Bible carefully, the women, quote, looked on from afar, unquote. So if you read this text, the overwhelming probability that was meant to be communicated was that Jesus died alone. And yet when we read the Passion narrative, we are told intimate things that nobody could have had access to. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus takes 3 of his disciples and goes a distance, and then he leaves them and he goes further alone and he prays a prayer, and we're told what the words of that prayer are. Who recorded that? Jesus didn't have time to tell them about it. As soon as he came out, he was arrested, and they never saw him again alive. So who recorded that prayer? It's interesting that that prayer is similar in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but changed rather dramatically in John. So which one's right? Jesus appears before the Sanhedrin, or maybe it wasn't technically the Sanhedrin, but the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. He's there alone, but the conversation back and forth is recorded. Did they have a tape recorder? Was there a scribe who wrote down everything that was said in shorthand? Then we're told about Jesus having a one-to-one conversation with Pontius Pilate, the Roman procurator. Nobody else was there. And yet we're told what the dialogue is. Maybe Pilate held a press conference as soon as Jesus was delivered to the soldiers and revealed the contents of that conversation. Next, we're told what Jesus said to the soldiers, what the soldiers said to Jesus, but he was alone there. And then we're told what Jesus says to the crowd when he's on the cross, and what the crowd says to Jesus. And then we're told what Jesus says to the thieves, and what the thieves say to Jesus. But again, we notice some discrepancy. In Mark, the thieves are simply part of the scenery. They never say a word. In Matthew, the thieves are both negative. They both rail against Jesus. Only in Luke does one of them become penitent. And the conversation is recorded verbatim. By the time you get to John, they've faded back into the woodwork. They never say a thing, one way or another. We're told what Jesus said from the cross. In the Christian tradition, many a Good Friday service has been dedicated to quote the 7 last words that Jesus spoke from the cross. But that's a really phony symbol. Matthew and Mark say he only said one thing from the cross. Just one, and that was the cry of despair. My God, why have you forsaken me? Nothing else does he say from the cross. When you get to Luke, that's far too bizarre for Jesus to have said. And so Luke changes it, dismisses what Matthew and Mark had said. And in Luke, it comes out with Jesus saying, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. That was much more palatable. That fitted much more with the image that was developing of who Jesus was. And then Luke adds a couple of things that nobody's ever heard of before. This is the late 9th or early 10th decade. He has Jesus speaking to the soldiers saying, Father, forgive them. He has Jesus speaking to the penitent thief. Today you will be with me in paradise. But nobody's ever heard about these things before. They're Lucan additions. Are they accurate? Then you get to John, the 4th gospel, and he dismisses everything that Mark and Matthew and Luke said. He gets rid of all the sayings. The only way the church got 7 last sayings was to put Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John together, and they're quite incompatible. It is finished becomes the way Jesus makes his final proclamation in John's gospel. And then John adds 2 other things that nobody's ever heard of. He has Jesus say, I thirst. And he has Jesus commend his mother to the care of the beloved disciple. That's the first time the mother of Mary, of Jesus, ever appears at the foot of the cross in the Christian written tradition. It's a 10th decade addition. Mel Gibson would die, and so would his movie, if he realized that. So there are all sorts of discrepancies. If it's an eyewitness account, who is correct? Is it possible that it is something other than an eyewitness account? And if so, what is it? Well, how do you get into this material? I submit that you put on a pair of Jewish lenses and try to read this material from a Jewish perspective. Let me start with the cry of dereliction. If a Jew were reading the story of Jesus saying from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? That Jewish person might well have recognized that word, that saying, because it was familiar in the Jewish tradition. All you need to do is to go to Psalm 22. It opens with the words, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now what is Psalm 22? The Psalms were the hymnal of the Jewish tradition. Psalm 22 was a psalm based upon a portrait of the Messiah developed by one we call Second Isaiah. That'd be chapters 40 through 55, with which you are all familiar, though you don't know that you're familiar with it, because you think it's Handel's Messiah. Handel's Messiah is bringing Second Isaiah to music. He's talking about Isaiah's servant. He's not talking about Jesus. He begins with the voice crying in the wilderness. And he goes on to this figure. And he describes him as despised, rejected, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. We hear those words in a magnificent contralto solo in Handel's Messiah, and we think he's talking about Jesus. He's talking about someone in Jewish mythology that Jews would be familiar with And it comes right out of Isaiah 40 to 55. Let me take just a moment to put that servant passage into history. The little nation of Judah had been overrun by the armies of Babylonia under the command of a man named Nebuchadnezzar. There were actually two battles, and almost all of the Jewish people, except the halt, the lame, and the blind, after those battles about a decade apart, were taken off into captivity. In that period of history we call the Babylonian captivity of the Jewish people took place. And these exiles remained in Babylon for 2, maybe 3 generations. And finally there came the time when Cyrus of the Persians defeated the Babylonians and proclaimed that the captive peoples could go free. And so an expedition was organized of these heretofore captive Jewish people to go back to scout out the land to prepare the way for the massive return. And they went with high hopes and great exhilaration. They were going to rebuild the Jewish nation, rebuild the city of Jerusalem, rebuild the wall, and above all else, rebuild the temple so that they could fulfill their historic God-given vocation, which was to be a blessing to all the nations of the world, a deeply universal theme in the chosen people. They weren't chosen for privilege. They were chosen for service. It was to be their vocation to bless all of the nations of the world, and they could only do this if they survived as a people. But when the expedition got back to Jerusalem, their exhilaration was changed into absolute despair. Their holy city was a pile of rubble. Their holy temple was a few pieces of broken crockery. The walls were non-existent. And the people who had moved in when the Jews had been moved out were not exactly welcoming. They didn't like seeing these people come back to reclaim land that they thought had been abandoned forever. And someone in that expedition, someone unknown, went into such deep depression. There was no way that the Jewish state would ever rise again. There was no way they would ever achieve power or status again. There was no way they could fulfill their messianic vocation to be a blessing to the nations of the world. At least no way that he could understand or foresee. And I think he sank into a kind of depression, and I don't know how long he stayed there. But when he came out, he charted a new understanding of what the Messianic people could do and be in those circumstances. If you have no power, you must use your weakness. If you are not victorious, you must bear your witness through defeat. And so he fashions this image of the suffering servant of God, whose role it is to absorb the anger and the hostility of the people of the world and not to return it as anger and hostility, but to return it in love. And this was the way, he said, that the Jewish people could fulfill their God-given vocation to be a blessing to the nations of the world, drain the world of its hostility and anger, absorb it, and return it as love. Now, needless to say, that wasn't a very popular messianic image. People don't like to volunteer for a life of masochism. But someone was so touched by that portrait that person saw to it that those words were preserved, and they didn't have a lot of extra scroll space, so they found some empty space on the back side of the scroll that contained the book of the prophet Isaiah. That was chapters 1 through 39, and they just added chapters 40 through 55. And so it became second Isaiah, but most people didn't make that distinction. They thought it was all one book. There were hundreds of years between first Isaiah and second Isaiah. And even there it was ignored, because that's not a very popular portrait. No one wants to volunteer to be the world's victim. But it stayed there as part of the Jewish tradition. And in the first century, as the life of Jesus unfolded, some of his disciples began to see in that portrait in 2nd Isaiah an image that helped them understand the life and the death of Jesus. And so it's a very popular image among the early followers of Jesus to relate Jesus to the suffering servant. And Psalm 22 was part of this servant imagery. And so Psalm 22 became very popular with the followers of Jesus. It's not surprising, therefore, that the first verse of Psalm 22 is placed into the mouth of Jesus as the only word he spoke from the cross in the first two Gospels to be written. So that becomes a clue. If they quoted the first verse of Psalm 22, is it possible that they quoted other things from that psalm as they were writing the story about the final events in the life of Jesus? So we continue to read that story, that psalm, and see what other connections we can find. Listen carefully. Psalm 22 goes on to say, "Those who see me mock at me. They make mouths at me. They wag their heads. He committed his cause to the Lord. Let God deliver him. Let God rescue him if God delights in him." That's Psalm 22 about the servant. Now read Matthew. "And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads. He trusts in God. Let God deliver him if God desires him." Do you not think some plagiarism is going on there? Matthew seems to be drawing heavily on Psalm 22. I love the story of the school teacher who called a young child up and accused him of cheating on an examination because his paper was identical with the paper of the little boy that sat next to him in school. And in his defense, this little kid said, "Well, how do you know I copied from him instead of him copying from me?" And the teacher said, "Well, on one question, this man said, 'I simply do not know the answer,' and you said, 'Me neither.'" Matthew is copying in developing his narrative, and Mark did it before him. He's copying from material in Psalm 22, almost verbatim. We keep reading Psalm 22. "They pierced my hands and my feet." That's Psalm 22. "I can count all my bones. They divide my garments among them, and upon my vesture they cast lots." Now listen to Matthew 27. "And when they had crucified him, they divided his garments among them by casting lots." There's a connection, folks. This is not the writings of an eyewitness. This is an interpreter of the Hebrew Scriptures trying to place Jesus into their meaning. Matthew is clearly drawing his material from Psalm 22. Well, if Psalm 22, based on Isaiah's portrait of the servant, has supplied some of the details in this passion narrative, perhaps we might look at Isaiah's servant passage directly and see if there are other connections. So we go to chapters 40 through 55, but we spend most of our time on chapter 53. And here you see the narrative developed from text in Isaiah 53. Isaiah 53 describes the climax of the servant's life. And here the servant is described this way in that contralto solo I just mentioned. Talking about the servant, he was despised, rejected, a man of sorrow and acquainted with griefs. And Isaiah goes on to say, he was wounded for our transgressions, and by his stripes we are healed. His stripes. Is that the account upon which the story of Jesus being lashed by the soldiers was drawn? Did they fill in that detail based upon that verse from the servant passages of Isaiah? We keep reading Isaiah 53. Of the servant it was said, he was numbered with the transgressors. The servant died surrounded by sinful people. Is that the source of the story of the two thieves, crucified one on each side of Jesus? Of the servant, it was said in Isaiah 53, he made intercession for his transgressors. Is that the source of Luke's story about Jesus praying for the soldiers and saying, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do? That's praying for one's transgressors. Or even Jesus' words to the penitent thief, today you will be with me in paradise, that only Luke records. Of the servant, it was said in Isaiah 53 that he was silent before his accusers. Is this the source of the detail in the Passion narrative, that when Jesus stood before the chief priest and the scribes and the elders and before Pilate, he refused to speak, he was silent, much to their dismay? Were they drawing the story to make it parallel to the servant? Of the servant, it was said again in Isaiah 53, he was with a rich man in his death. Is that the germ upon which the story of Joseph of Arimathea was created? He's described in Mark as a ruler among the Jews. He's described in Matthew as a rich man. Was Matthew deliberately placing a Joseph at the end of Jesus' life, just as he deliberately placed a Joseph at the beginning of Jesus' life? On both ends of Jesus' life, there was a Joseph, a significant Jewish name, placed to legitimatize him at his birth, and now to provide him with dignity at his death. When the disciples had all forsaken him, Joseph appears on both ends of his life to provide him with dignity and cover. When we discover that almost every detail of the Passion narrative, as we know it, is derived not from an eyewitness account, but from the Hebrew Scriptures written some 500 to 600 years before the life of Jesus, then we can no longer suggest that this narrative is history. The Hebrew Scriptures are being used to interpret and to show the meaning of the life of Jesus of Nazareth. When you and I literalize these stories, we will destroy the meaning. Every Jew would have recognized what this was about. They would have seen these connections. Then why was the story written the way it was written? If it's not an eyewitness report, remember there were no eyewitnesses. It's based on Hebrew Scriptures. What were they trying to accomplish in telling this magnificent narrative? May I suggest that the Passion narrative, which makes up 25 to 40% of all four of the Gospels, was originally created to be liturgy, not biography. Liturgy, not history. Liturgy. It was a way that people in the generation that Matthew and Mark wrote their story could enter into the last days of Jesus and to the meanings of Jesus and have those meanings illumined through the Hebrew Scriptures. The Passion narrative is not an attempt to tell us how Jesus died. It's an attempt to tell us who Jesus was and what his life meant. And I submit to you that that's a far more profound way to read these stories than to pretend that this is biography or history. Now, is there any indication in the text that we're reading liturgy instead of history? That would be helpful if we could find that. And all I can tell you is that we know from early Christian history that a practice developed probably as early as the 2nd century in which worshipers were encouraged to watch with Jesus through the last 24 hours of his life. They developed a kind of 24-hour vigil to mark the time from sundown on what we call Maundy Thursday to sundown on what we call Good Friday. And in various parts of the Christian church, more in the liturgical branches of Catholic and Lutheran and Anglican, you still see some of the images of this 24-hour liturgy. You have the Maundy Thursday recalling of the Last Supper. In some churches, they sign up and people watch through the hours of the night. So there's somebody there. And in that tradition, they would have the reserved sacrament in an ombre so people could watch by the body of Christ, in effect. And the next morning, they would have what they call the Mass of the pre-sanctified host. You wouldn't celebrate the communion. You don't celebrate anything on Good Friday, but you receive the sacrament from a previous consecration. And then we had that 3-hour service. It went from 12 to 3. And then we had the tradition that Lent and all of its fast ended at sundown on Good Friday. We had the vestiges. You can still see the vestiges of this 24-hour liturgy. So knowing that the Christian church is going to develop in that direction, we turn and look backwards and say, when did that tradition start? And that's when we examine Mark and Matthew, the earliest two narratives of the last day in Jesus' life, and we read the text carefully, and we discover it's divided into 8 3-hour units. The time references are almost always in place. Let me trace them quickly. When is the Last Supper held? The text says, when evening came. That means it's about 6 o'clock. How long does the Passover last? About 3 hours. How does the Passover end? They sing a hymn and go out into the night. And so Mark and Matthew portray the Passover as lasting from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m., and they say after they sang a hymn, they went out into the night. It's very clear. Where did they go? They went to Gethsemane. What happened there? Jesus had his disciples go with him, and they could not watch with him 1 hour, 2 hours, or 3 hours. The demarcations are there. The 3 hours have passed. The second watch of the liturgy is over. And they come out of Gethsemane so that the betrayal can take place at midnight, the darkest deed in human history, according to their point of view, happening at the darkest moment of the night. Very dramatic, but probably not historical. But it communicated. And the betrayal in both Mark and Matthew was by Judas, who bore the name of the nation, and by the leaders of the nation, the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders, and that takes up the watch of the night between 12 midnight and 3 o'clock in the morning. Can't be history. The Jewish Sanhedrin was forbidden to sit in judgment except in the light of day. This is an interpretive story. This is not literal history. And guess what they call the watch of the night between 3 a.m. and 6? They called it cockcrow. So into that 3-hour period, you put the denial of Peter. He denies 3 times, 1 for each hour before the cock crows, and announces that the morning has arrived. And right on key, the text of Mark and Matthew says, when morning came, that means 6 a.m., they delivered Jesus to Pilate. And the trial before Pilate takes place from 6 to 9. And then Mark says, Matthew omits this note, but Mark says, they crucified him at the 3rd hour, that's 9 a.m. Then they describe the crucifixion and the conversations. And that goes on until 12 noon. And at 12 noon, darkness covers the whole earth. Is that literal? Was there an eclipse of the sun? Or were they saying when the light of God is snuffed out in the person of Jesus, the whole world is plunged into darkness? And guess how long that darkness lasted? It lasted for 3 hours. The 7th watch of the 8 watches of the 24-hour day is complete, and that leaves just enough time to carry out the burial. Because the next day was the Sabbath. The Sabbath began at sundown. You cannot bury the dead on the Sabbath. That would be the violation of the law. So Joseph of Arimathea comes in, and they do a fairly elaborate burial between 3 and 6. And then the sun goes down, and the 24-hour liturgy is over. The Passion narrative reflects the fact that the Christian community, all of whom were Jews at this time in history, took the Passover's 3 hours and stretched it into 24 hours and developed a liturgical way that they could constantly recall the meaning of the life of Jesus and what his death meant. They were not writing history. They were discovering meaning. There is a great difference. If you read John's Gospel, which is probably the most powerfully interpretive work, you discover that John says that the climax of Jesus' life, where his meaning was revealed, was not in the resurrection, but in the crucifixion. It's only in John's Gospel that Jesus says, when I am lifted up, I will do two things. I will draw all people to myself. And when I am lifted up, then they will know that I am. Then they will know the meaning of God. This is not a guilt message. This is not Jesus dying for your sins, as we've been told so often. This is Jesus becoming so deeply and fully human that he can escape the biological drive to survival that marks every one of us and be free to give his life away in love to others, no matter what the cost. So what John was saying was that Jesus reveals God when he's able to give his life away, because there's nothing you can do and nothing you can be that will ever separate you from the love of God. That's what the Jesus message is all about. It's not about theology and the doctrine of the Holy Trinity. It's about seeing the love of God being lived out through the life of a human being. And when Jesus was free to die, he was also free to reveal the meaning of life. When we read our Gospels with Jewish eyes and see our connections with our Jewish past, see the suffering servant draining the world of its anxiety and hostility and pain and returning it to love, you're reading an early Jewish Christian interpretation of the life of Jesus of Nazareth. And if that is what the Christian faith is all about, it is a very new and different way to see this faith than the one in which most of us have been reared. But it's not really new at all, because what we are doing is recovering the original Jewish context in which the story of Jesus was told. And so I invite you to scrape off the barnacles of the way we have been told the Christian story and open up its symbols. Look at them with their original Jewish meaning and hear the call of the Christ not to be religious. God knows we've got enough religion in this world, and most of it is evil. Jesus is not about religion. I've had rather, I don't want to be insulting, but I've had rather strict evangelical fundamentalist Christians tell me that if I didn't believe the way they believed, I would be going to hell. My response is, I believe I'd rather be in hell than spend eternity with people like you. Christianity is about coming into the fullness of life, not having some weapon with which you can beat up somebody else. It's about learning to live with the life of God, learning to love with the love of God. It's about having the courage to be as you participate in the very being of God. It is a religious system not designed to make us right or to make us moral or to give us power. It's a system designed to make us whole. John's Jesus is the one who says, the only purpose I have for coming into this world is that you might have life and have it abundantly. So the goal of the Christian faith is not to make you religious. It's to make you whole. It's to give you the power to love yourself, to be able to live fully, love wastefully, and be all that you can be. And the only real mission of the Christian church is not to convert the heathen. The only real mission is to build a world in which every other child of God has an opportunity to live more fully and to love more wastefully and to be more truly and clearly all that they were created to be. And that's the kind of Christianity that I think will live in the 21st century. Thank you all very much for your attention. Thank you. We have time for questions. I don't make a rule, but I've had a request that those who ask questions on previous days might give way to those who have not had an opportunity to ask a question. So keep that in mind, and you be your own conscience. We'll have ladies over here, gentlemen over here, and I trust they're all ladies and all gentlemen. And we will proceed with ladies first, and we'll go as long as we can go, and then I think I'll be back over on the porch to see anybody else that would like to talk with me. Yes, ma'am, you be first.
Thank you. Good afternoon. 1 Corinthians 12:8.
Don't move away from the mic, just kiss it.
Okay. 1 Corinthians 12:18 tells us that wisdom, knowledge,
You
and
got to stop a minute. Pull the mic down so you can get to it. You're way above.
Okay,
Now
how's
you
that?
got it.
1 Corinthians 12:18 tells us that wisdom, knowledge, and prophecy are gifts of the Spirit given to people for the common good. Do you believe that God called you to develop and teach a non-literal approach to the Bible and Christianity? And if so, why do you think she chose you?
I must say I'm not hearing your question. I'm sorry. It's running all together.
Okay.
I heard the quotation from,
All right.
I'm always afraid when I start out by quoting the Bible, but go ahead.
I was afraid not to. Do you believe that God called you to develop and teach a non-literal approach to the Bible and Christianity? And if so, why do you think she chose you?
And my mother always loved me, and I think that's probably why I was chosen. I can't speculate about things like that. You do what you do, you live what you live, you try to be true to who you are, and if somebody is helped by it, you give thanks. But you don't calculate. Can you imagine calculating that I am called to deliteralize the scriptures so that all the fundamentalists in the world can be more intelligent? That's pretty arrogant stuff. No, I don't think that's what you do. I walk into the mystery of God. I walk the Christ path because that's the path I know how to walk. But if I walk that path deeply enough and fully enough and honestly enough, I believe I will escape all of the boundaries of my own religion, because I don't think God is bound by my religion. God is greater than my religion. My religion is a pathway into the mystery of God, and that's the meaning of everybody's religion. So walk your pathway with integrity, but be willing to walk beyond the boundaries of your religious system, because the holy God is not bound by any human creation. And every religion is a human creation, and we need to be aware of that. Religion is not eternal. God is. A big difference. Thank you. Yes?
Thank you for the refreshment and the opening of new pathways to not only read Matthew, but to behold the faith in its broader and greater dimensions. My question goes to a question that was raised a couple of sessions back. I couldn't quite get here in time to ask it, but it's still appropriate for me, and I think appropriate for everyone here. And that is, we leave with a great sense of joy in as you've kind of taken the scales off our eyes in a lot of ways.
Just get to the question. I hear the preamble. What's the question?
Question is that all of us have great pain, and when we go home, part of that pain is that every one of us either have family members or deep friends with whom we cannot have this discussion.
Yeah.
neither can we have it at family gatherings and meetings. Therefore, is there something you can say to us in a few minutes that would help us deal with this painfulness that has caused families to be so separated?
I remember some years ago I was doing some lectures in Australia, and I was in Hobart. I just finished an ABC television program. That's Australian Broadcasting Company, not American Broadcasting Company. And I went to the desk and they called me a cab, and I went out and got in the cab to go back to my home. And the cab driver wouldn't drive away. He just sat there. And after a while I said, "Is something wrong?" And he said, "Are you Bishop Spong?" Well, I'm not used to being recognized by cab drivers in Hobart, Australia. But I confess that that is who I am. And he said, "Your work has saved my family." Well, what do you do when you want to go home and the cab driver is... So I said, "Well, tell me about this." And he said his daughter had married a member of the Jehovah's Witness community, and that marriage had turned his daughter into being a kind of fundamentalist who had no time for anybody who didn't share her fundamentalist point of view, and that the whole family had broken apart over their religious debates and discussions. And he said, "Would you mind if instead of driving you to where you're going, I drive you to my home and introduce you to my wife?" And I said, "Fine with me." So I got in the front seat, not the back seat. Seemed more appropriate. And he drove to her home, and he got at the back door, and he went in through a fence, and his wife was not exactly dressed for visitors, and the house was pretty messy. The kids' toys were all over the floor, and his wife was clearly not near as thrilled to see me as he was. But he ran running upstairs and got a copy of a book called Rescuing the Bible from Fundamentalism, and brought it down and asked me to sign it, and it was ratted all around the pages, and it was underlined all over the place. And somehow, something I'd said in that book had helped him to love his fundamentalist daughter. That's the secret. Don't argue with your fundamentalist relatives. Love them. You're not going to change them by arguing. Arguing is hostile. They are trying to survive. Religion is a security shell around them, and if you rip away their security shell, they're going to respond with hostility. That's not helpful. They have to lay that shell down themselves. You can't rip it apart. It's like an onion. You rip the onion layer, and all you get is tears. You've got to let people become so secure they can drop their security system and hear what you've got to say, and you only do that by loving them. My mother was a fundamentalist. She died at age 92. She died a fundamentalist. But she was like every good Jewish mother. Everybody ought to have a Jewish mother. She loved me no matter what I said or did. And I'd done a series of lectures in Charlotte where she lived on the changing patterns in human sexual behavior, and particularly focusing on gay-lesbian issues. It had been well covered by the press, and I starred in the letters to the editor for about 6 weeks after that, with every evangelical quoting Leviticus in their letter to the editor to condemn me. And my mother would get up and she'd drink her cup of tea with her magnifying glass, and she'd read these letters to the editor about what a vile and difficult creature her son was. And I called her in the middle of a bunch of these letters. I said, "Mother, how are you?" And she said, "I'm fine, son, but I don't understand why all these people don't like you." And I said, "Well, Mother, what is it you don't understand? Maybe if you had asked me a question, I could answer it and you would understand it." And she said, "Well, son, what is a heterosexual?" When you have to start at that point in the sexual debate, you know you're wasting your time. So I said, "Well, that's what you are, Mother." And she said, "Well, that must be all right." And that's the way the conversation went. I think I don't argue with fundamentalists. I try to love them. I try to recognize that they're speaking out of their insecurity and their fear. And you let them lay that security blanket down. You do not ever try to rip it away. It's hostile to rip away the defensive shelter of a fundamentalist, whether it's a fundamentalist Jew or a fundamentalist Muslim or a fundamentalist Christian. And so I hope that we learn not to do that. You don't engage it, you just love them. You don't compromise. You might say, well, I just don't agree, but don't engage the issues, because love alone will bring them to a new understanding. Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Are you in the ladies' mic? This is the men's mic. I have to have a lady next. We just had a man. So come over here and you can get to the front of the men's line. Go ahead. Oh, that's your wife?
No.
You're going to speak for her? Oh, that will never do. But she's not your wife. Okay. Yeah, the male's line's over here. I'm glad you didn't know the difference.
I just got here today, so you may have answered this earlier in the week, but who do you think wrote the four Gospels?
Who do I think wrote the four Gospels? I don't have any idea. We used to say when I was in seminary that there's a better chance that the lesser known two, Mark and Luke, might have been the authors, certainly not Matthew and John. Now, there's a tradition in scholarship today that John's written by a man called John the Elder who lived in Ephesus, and there may be some basis for that, but certainly not John Zebedee. And the beloved disciple is not John Zebedee, and that just needs to be dismissed forever. There hadn't been a biblical scholar that thought the beloved disciple was John Zebedee since the early years of the 19th century, except it hadn't gotten down to the pew yet. Rudolf Bultmann, whom I consider to be the greatest New Testament scholar of the 20th century, a German who spent his life at the University of Marburg, in his really magnificent commentary on John's Gospel, postulates that the beloved disciple is not a figure of history at all, but a symbol of the ideal Christian. He's portrayed as intimately related to Jesus. The first time he appears in the fourth Gospel, he's leaning on his breast at the Last Supper. That's his first appearance. He's the only disciple that goes all the way to the cross with Jesus. He's the only disciple who goes to the tomb and who believes. He's the ideal Christian and not a character of history at all. John 21, the appendix to John, which is clearly written at a later time by a later hand, tries to confuse that issue by bringing John Zebedee back into the picture, bringing the beloved disciple back into the picture. So I don't know who wrote any of the Gospels. You know, we used to have a book called The Beloved Physician, which is the biography of Luke. I've forgotten who wrote it, Taylor Caldwell maybe. Anyway, that's based upon a tiny shred of evidence in a pseudo-Pauline epistle. There's very little historical basis for that. In Matthew the tax collector, the story of Levi Matthew the tax collector is told in Mark and in Matthew, but nowhere else. Whoever wrote Matthew's gospel was a Jewish scribe who headed up a congregation of Jewish people who had become disciples of Jesus. But he's anonymous. None of these names are attached to the Gospels until well into the 2nd century. So we had the Gospels. We can date the Gospels by internal evidence more than anything else. And Mark is dated somewhere in the early 70s because he clearly is on the other side of the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans that took place in 70. Matthew is dated in the early to mid 80s because he clearly incorporates all of Mark into his Gospel. And you can't incorporate it overnight. And Luke incorporates about 50% of Mark into his gospel and writes for a community of diaspora Jews who are beginning to be infiltrated by what they call Gentile proselytes. And Luke appears to have been born a Gentile and converted to Judaism and then came into the Christian movement through the synagogue. Interestingly enough, he's the only gospel writer that includes the 3 initiatory rites for becoming a Jew: circumcision on the 8th day, presentation in the temple on the 40th day, and some kind of bar mitzvah or puberty rite when he was 12 years old and was taken up to Jerusalem. And John is written clearly after the split between synagogue and church. We think that took place around the year 88. John is dated somewhere between 95 and 100. I don't worry about who wrote them. I just try to engage the message, and I don't know that the world of biblical scholarship can ever get any deeper than that. Yes, sir. You're now at the right microphone. I thought you were having a sexual identity crisis.
No. Why then, if Jesus was crucified between 9 and 12, do we celebrate our 3 hours from 12 to 3? Shouldn't we celebrate it based on what you're saying from 9 to 12 then?
Yeah, if you want to be a biblical literist, it should be a 6-hour service and from 9 to 3, but I think the clergy union opposed that. So we have the 3-hour service. And I must say, I love to do the 3-hour service, and I've tried to do one every year. And most churches don't want them anymore. I did one in Morristown at my home parish last Sunday, and I don't take the 7 last words. I think that's totally phony. What I do is to take the Passion Story according to Mark and develop it in 6 30-minute services, or the Passion Story of Matthew and develop it in 6 30-minute services, or the Passion Story of John and develop it in 6 30-minute services. And the response has been pretty good to that, and I think that's the way we ought to go. I don't want to lose Good Friday, because I think if you lose Good Friday, Easter becomes a fairly shallow day of bunny rabbits and flowers and Easter fashions and the Easter parade.
But what you're saying is we should do it from 9 to 12, since that's when he was crucified, in your view? Is that?
No, he's crucified from 9 to 3.
Okay.
6 hours. And as I say, I don't believe you're going to sell 6 hours in any church I know of. So we take the 3 hours of the darkness, and that has become the historic place where Good Friday is observed. In my church, it's now observed in the 1 hour, somewhere from 12 to 1. And to me, I think it's truncated. I'd like for us to recover Good Friday, but it has to be done in a downtown church, I think, of all denominations gathering together, and then it begins to have some power and meaning. Anyway, thank you for your question, and forgive me for moving you to the other side of the room. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. This question has kind of been forming for me all week, so I hope I can be clear. But is there anything in the Gospels that you would say were actual words that Jesus spoke, or actual, either the parables or actual miracles that he performed, anything that you would say was actually legitimately his?
Yeah, it's a good question. That's the question the Jesus Seminar spent 15 years trying to answer. And when they finished, they published a book called The 5 Gospels. That was sort of confusing. They took the Gospel of Thomas and elevated it into the canon. And then they took that old pattern of putting the words of Jesus in red letters. And they went through every word attributed to Jesus and studied it. And this is about 250 of the best scripture scholars in America of all traditions. And they would discuss these things, each of these red letter verses, for days, sometimes weeks. And then they would vote. They voted with 4 beads. If you put a red bead in, you were saying this is the authentic voice of Jesus being heard. If you put a pink bead in, you were voting this sounds like Jesus, but it's clearly been filtered through the Christian community, so it's no longer identical. If you put a gray bead in, that means the overwhelming probability is that this is a product of the Christian church read back into Jesus and not the word of Jesus. And if they put a black bead in, that meant there ain't no way Jesus ever said this. It's interesting that the Gospel of John had only 2 pink beads. Everything else was gray and black. Let me illustrate one of those that Jesus could never have said. Jesus could never have said, you've got to take up your cross and follow me, because the cross had absolutely no meaning until he was crucified on it, except that of an electric chair or a hangman's noose. You don't pick up an electric chair to follow Jesus. But Jesus, by his death, had transformed the meaning of the cross. And that's clearly a word from the early church put back into the mouth of Jesus. And I don't think for a moment that Jesus said any of the I am sayings in the 4th gospel. I think if somebody came up to me and said, oh, by the way, I am the bread of life, or I am the living water, or I am the way, the truth, I am the resurrection, I think I would think that they needed some mental health attention. I don't think that would reveal divinity to me. But if you recognize that what John's gospel is saying is that the community of believers around Jesus had found in him that which satisfies the deepest hunger of our souls, then you can hear him saying, I am the bread of life. If you believe that in your relationship with Jesus, your deepest thirst has been satisfied, you can hear him say, I am the living water. If you find a sense of community, you can hear him say, I am the vine, you are the branches. Those make great sense when you see them as the experience of the community of believers, but they make no sense if you think they were the literal words spoken by Jesus of Nazareth. So that, the conclusion of the Jesus Seminar after 15 years was that 16% of all the words attributed to Jesus in the four Gospels are authentic or very close to being authentic sayings of the Jesus of history. And 84% are either tempered by the influence of the church or made up by the church or interpretations by the church that had little to nothing to do with Jesus. It's an interesting, and that book's available in any library today. You might find it interesting just to thumb through it and see which ones they give red and which ones they give pink and which ones they give gray and which ones they give black. The Jesus Seminar has been a great asset in my life, and I really rejoice that I've had the privilege of working with these people over a period of about 15, 16 years. But when they published their findings, Pat Robertson of noted fame said, Jesus has a ghostwriter. That's what they're saying, a ghostwriter. Well, that's interesting. Jerry Falwell had a ghostwriter. Jerry Falwell learned to write his autobiography, but he didn't know how to write, so he hired a ghostwriter. This ghostwriter lived very closely with Jerry for 2 or 3 years while he got the material to write the autobiography. His name was Mel White. And when the autobiography came out, Mel White came out and began to picket Jerry's church, the Thomas Road Baptist Church, and began to try to get Jerry to be less strident and hostile toward gay and lesbian people. And finally, just to finish the story that's kind of fun, Jerry agreed that he would meet with 200 born-again, young evangelical gay and lesbian people. Jerry didn't believe there were 200 born-again, evangelical gay and lesbian people. But he agreed to meet with them, and he agreed to eat with them. And then he began to get a little shaky. And he said, no, I don't believe I can eat with them. I'll meet with them, but don't believe I can eat with them. Because the Bible says you should not eat with sinners. And we said, who do you eat with, Jerry? Can you even eat alone, Jerry? And that's when insight begins to dawn. When Jerry Falwell died, he was a very different man from the man I first met when we both lived in Lynchburg. He hadn't gotten over his homophobia, but he had largely gotten over his racial attitudes, his racism. Liberty Baptist University was born as a segregation academy to avoid integrating schools. But Jerry grows, and you give people credit for growing. And today, no picture of the choir from Liberty Baptist College ever shows on TV without significant black faces in it. It's a sort of, it's a salt and pepper kind of choir, and that's a big step. Anyway, that's not apropos anything except my history. Yes, sir.
Which of the 16% of those words which the seminar found probably are Jesus' words turn you on and might lead you to say, he's my man, or he's my Lord?
I don't know that I could answer that the way you've asked it, because I think some of the more profound words are the words that were placed into his mouth by people who finally understood who he was than the things he actually said. I'm deeply drawn to this figure of Jesus, and that really surprises people who think I'm sort of a liberal heretic. I'm deeply drawn to this figure, but I'm much more drawn to the power of his life than I am to anything he says or does. You ask about which parables are authentic. Folks, you just need to look at the Bible sometimes to know how to answer your own questions. The parables that most people know, the most popular and most familiar parables, don't appear but in one of the four Gospels. Parable of the Good Samaritan, the parable of Lazarus and the rich man, the parable of the prodigal son are by every measure the most popular parables among Christians, and they don't occur in any source until Luke writes in the late 9th or early 10th decade. There is a variation of the parable of the prodigal son in Matthew of the two brothers, but it's not developed nearly the way it's developed. So did Luke do the development? It certainly wasn't done by Jesus. Is it true? Well, if you know something about how the Gospels are read against the background of the liturgical year of the synagogue, Luke's parable of the prodigal son was read against the background of that passage that I mentioned the other day in Deuteronomy that says if a child is willfully disobedient, the child shall be executed. Luke has Jesus say there was this really disobedient kid who took his father's living and wasted it in Sin City. If you live in Mississippi, that's Memphis. And then went home and found that the father still welcomed him and loved him. And that's the message of the parable of the prodigal son. And it's played against this prescription that if a child is willfully disobedient, the child shall be put to death. But that's to read the Bible with a different set of eyes from the way we read it. I work on the Bible every day of my life, and I do it quite systematically. I will begin about the 1st of September to do an exhaustive, maybe up to 5-year study of Luke's gospel, which is the only one I have not really engaged, and I think is a fantastic gospel. If I live long enough, I hope I'll do a book on Luke, but that's asking a lot of the Lord. But we'll see.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let me go over here. Though there are no more ladies. Okay, we'll go to a man. I'm not prejudiced.
Thank you.
My wife tells me this will be the last question. I'm sorry that time has run out. And look, it's getting ready to
I may be
rain.
missing your interpretation, but I understand that God is in you, God is in all our surroundings, He is in us, and that Jesus was not the incarnate, as I understand from you, from the time that John dunked him in the Jordan River. That's your understanding, as I interpret it. I may be totally wrong about that. And you talked about the Trinity, and my question is about the Trinity. Could you tell us your interpretation of the Trinity? Thank you.
I'll try. We need to develop some history about the Bible. The Bible is written, the Hebrew Scriptures are written somewhere between 1000 BCE, and, I would guess Malachi would be in the 3rd century, but that's sort of where it's written. It's about 1,000 years, and it's mostly BCE years. The Gospels, the epistles are written between 51 and 64 of the 1st century. The Gospels are written between 7203 and 100. And the last book of the New Testament is probably 2 Peter, and it's dated somewhere around 135 to 140 of the Common Era. The creeds don't come into the Christian tradition until the 4th century. The creeds reflect a dualistic Greek-thinking background that nobody in the Hebrew world could ever have understood. God and human life are two separate categories in Greece. Heaven and earth are two separate categories. Spirit and flesh are two separate categories. Souls and bodies are two separate categories. They're like oil and water, and so when the Christians try to say that we've met God in the person of Jesus, they have a hard time bringing those two together. So incarnation is a Greek word. It won't appear anywhere in the Bible. It means to enflesh God. And so you have the story, and it's told mythologically, that God is the father of Jesus by a virgin from Galilee. And that's the way the two come together. But that's based on 1st century genetics that no geneticist today would admit. Just all wrong. When you get to incarnation, you have God coming down into the life of a human being. So God looks a bit like Superman taking over Clark Kent's life. You know, Clark Kent's a perfectly normal-looking human being, but he's really Superman in disguise, and you don't know that until he goes into a phone booth and takes off his shirt and you see the big S. And that's not the way the Bible understood the divine relationship. I meet God in the person of Jesus, but I think Jesus is human. But I think if the humanity of each of us becomes deep enough and full enough and free enough, we become channels through which that which is ultimately real and ultimately holy can flow. And so the medium and the message blend. So I have no trouble saying God was in Christ, because it's in the fullness of Jesus' humanity that I always meet the presence of God. The Trinity is an attempt to do mathematics on God, and it doesn't work. I don't know how you say that God is anything. I don't mind, as I said the other day, I don't mind telling people I'm a Trinitarian, because that describes my God experience. I experience God as other. I experience God as depth. I experience God through the lives of other people, and most particularly through the life of Jesus of Nazareth. So I don't mind saying my experience is a Trinitarian experience, but I'd never say, therefore, God is a Trinity, because I don't think my human mind can ever define God, nor do I think the Pope can, or Jerry Falwell can, or anybody else in this world can. God is the ultimate mystery into which or into whom I live. God is not somebody that I've got to get my brain around. So to conclude this, and I think we've got to because we've got to leave, to conclude this, let me just repeat something I said yesterday. God is not a noun that you and I have to define. God is a verb that you and I need to learn how to live. And it's in the living of the meaning of God that we experience the depth of that concept. I've loved being with you this week. Thank you so much for coming. Hope I'll see you again.